I just finished Metroid Samus Returns on the 3DS for the very first time, which means it's time to sit down and give my full review of the game. My name is James, and I started this channel simply because I love video games. If that sounds like you, please subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos just like this one. Samus Returns is the 3DS remake of Return of Samus from the original Game Boy. It was the only mainline game in the series that I had never played before, so I was pretty excited to jump in and check it out. I played the game on my new 3DS XL, and I believe that I played the game for about 20 hours. However, the in-game clock says that I spent closer to 12. I did notice right off the bat that there weren't a lot of settings and options that you could really choose from. And so with all of that out of the way, let's get started with the positives. So top of the positive list is that this game feels both fresh and familiar. I felt like I was at an advantage over the game because I have played all of the other mainline Metroid games, that I really felt like my knowledge of previous Metroid games really helped me enjoy this game to the fullest. And just like any other Metroid game, the progression through the game here is largely based on collecting items that will let you explore new areas and defeat new enemies. Exploration and the map are both parts of the game that I found to be enjoyable. The map had hardly any writing on it, but it was easy to understand what was going on. And I also liked the inclusion. They might do this in all of the 2D Metroid games, but they don't do this in Metroid Prime. If you haven't gotten if you haven't gotten an item yet in a room, it will denote that on the map, which makes going around and getting collectibles for either the end game or if you're just trying to get stronger to defeat a particular boss, it can make that a lot easier as well. Another thing that I liked with there being so many bosses in this game, if you die fighting a boss, you're often given a checkpoint right before you go in the boss room, which can allow you to go around and gather more health or more ammo, or just go right back into the boss again instead of starting over at the previous save station, which is the standard for other Metroid games. Those checkpoints were especially appreciated later in the game when save stations were few and far between and journeying to the different bosses got more and more difficult. Not even to mention that the bosses themselves were often very strong, and most of them took me lots and lots of tries. And then the last positive that I feel like I should mention is the item variety in the game. Pretty much all of your standard Metroid items make an appearance, with the exclusion of the speed booster, which I love excluding the speed booster because it is my least favorite item in every Metroid game. That gets all of our positives out of the way. Let's move on to the mixed. First thing that I should talk about in mixed is the controls. And I generally feel like the game controls pretty well, and a lot of the controls are pretty standard for Metroid games as well. Two specific things that I felt like I should bring up. I didn't like in the beginning of the game that you cannot use the D-pad to move. You use the D-pad to select special abilities, but for me, 2D side-scrollers, I always want to play with the D-pad. However, I do know that when you're standing and shooting, they do want you to be able to have the full 360 motion on there, so I get why that's not really an option. And then another thing related to controls, I kept trying to hit a button on the touchscreen to drop power bombs. You have to actually hit one of the face buttons on the DS to drop the bomb, even though there is a button for power bombs on the touchscreen. That didn't really make sense to me, but those are both just kind of more minor nitpicks with the controls. The combat in your level exploration is something that was a little bit mixed for me as well. Early on in the game, you kind of end up in this cycle that you're able to kill enemies, and then you'll find enemies that are a little bit harder, and then all of a sudden enemies will get to the point where you can't really kill them. And then you'll get a weapon that's more powerful, and then you're able to mow down pretty much all of the enemies. And then this cycle will just kind of continue until you get to the final areas of the game. But in the late game, in like the final areas of the game, it felt like you could only kill some of the basic enemies with special attacks, which I found to be kind of annoying because I wanted to save up all of my special attack power for bosses and stuff. So I wasn't a huge fan of that. I would have liked for those late game enemies to be a little bit weaker or just give me a weapon that's a little bit stronger. And unfortunately, that does bring us to the negative part of my review. I want to go ahead and say I might get kind of passionate about some of these negatives, but I don't want anybody to make the mistake of thinking that I didn't enjoy this game. So of the 5 mainline Metroid games that I've played, this is probably one of my favorite ones, and I especially like that I was able to get through the entire game without looking anything up. That being said, let's talk negatives. Most notably is that I found the boss variety to be very poor. The basic premise of the game is that you are going to this area to eradicate the Metroid population. And so there's 40 Metroids, and so each of the Metroids is treated as a different boss. However, there's only 2 bosses in the whole game that aren't Metroids. I think what I would have liked is to make the individual Metroid fights probably a little bit less significant. I know that that's the basic premise of the whole game, but it felt kind of wrong to me. It felt kind of wrong to me that we weren't fighting very many bosses. The next thing that I really need to bring up is that the late game felt pretty padded. I mentioned earlier not being able to destroy regular enemies with regular attacks, that you needed to do special attacks, and that kind of stuff felt like it was just thrown in there to slow you down. Early on in the game, you kind of get into a rhythm of, all right, we get an item, we get this Metroid, we get that Metroid, we get this Metroid, we get that Metroid, we get an item, we do this, we do that. And then later on, you are still getting an item, but it would be more of, you get an item, you explore for 20, 30 minutes, you're fighting your way through these impassable rooms and fighting hordes of very strong enemies, and the time in between the rewards was extended to the point where there would be times where I could sit down and play the game for 30 or 45 minutes, and I wouldn't even really feel like I actually made any progress because I didn't find any Metroids or new items or expansions or anything in that time frame. And then the biggest one for me is probably that the late game bosses, specifically the final boss and the boss before the final boss. So the final 2 bosses, they feel just like damage sponges, and they feel like you have to perfectly execute dodges for like 10 whole minutes while you're chipping away at their health, which I know that health bars aren't really a Metroid thing, but I did find it annoying that they have so much health and that they don't even have like a health bar or anything. Like, they change color a little bit when you're damaging them, so you can use that. It can be tough in the heat of battle to take a second and use that as a gauge to see how dead they are. I also kind of felt like bosses in the end, specifically, once again, those last 2 bosses, I felt like they did way too much damage when they hit you. We're talking bosses that you probably have to hit, that you have to attack them like hundreds of times. And for the most part, if they hit you like 3, 4, 5 times, you're probably dead. And I think that bothers me more because they're both multi-stage fights as well. And so maybe if you were to get like a checkpoint or something like in between the stages to make it a little bit easier. But I do also think that this is the final boss being ridiculously hard is a way that I felt about every Metroid game. So it is very possible that that's just a me problem, and I did eventually be able to learn the patterns and perfectly dodge for 20 straight minutes while fighting these guys, but you're putting so much into the perfect execution of this fight that when you finally beat it, it doesn't even really feel exciting to win. It's more so of like a finally, I don't have to do that anymore. I think what bothers me most about the bosses is that Metroid to me has always been about exploration. Exploration, collecting items, solving puzzles, using more of your wit to take out enemies instead of your brawn. And I feel like that's not really an option with the final bosses in this game. Guys, that's all that I have to say about Metroid Samus Returns. In the comment section, please let me know what you think about this game. As always, the best way to keep up with me is on Twitter and on Instagram at James_Solar. Thanks, guys.